My sister and I have always been close. When we moved out after college, we stayed in roughly the same area, so we made a point of visiting often. Until 2019 anyway, because she moved several hours north for a new job. I promised I would drive up to see her and her new place as soon as I could, but the pandemic hit and I had to delay my trip for about a year and a half. When I was finally able to go, I was so excited. I was looking forward to seeing my sister and getting some peace and quiet. 2 days before I was supposed to go, Janet called me and she seemed, I don't know, a little off. She teased me about little things like remembering to pack my toothbrush and extra socks, but she sounded kind of nervous. Then she told me that it was very important that I get an early start so I would get there before dark. I brushed it off because she's always made fun of me for being a late riser. But then she repeated it and said it was serious because the road to her house always gets dark super fast. She even made me promise that I would leave early to get there before sundown. I didn't see why it was such a big deal because I drive home from work at night all the time, but I figured she was just being a typical overprotective big sister, so I promised. We said goodbye and hung up. Fast forward to the day of the trip. I set my alarm early, but it didn't go off, so I overslept and had to start way later than I wanted. I felt bad because I'd promised, but it wasn't really my fault anyway, so oh well, right? At first, nothing out of the ordinary happened, but once I left the city and started on that long stretch of highway that cuts through the middle of nowhere, some weird stuff started happening. I'd look at the time and then I'd blink, and it would be like 30 minutes later, or my radio would cut out suddenly or switch channels on its own. The longer I drove, the more frequent the weird stuff became. It started off slow but ramped up to something happening every couple minutes. And then the sun set. Okay, I thought Janet was over-exaggerating when she told me about this, and you probably think I'm over-exaggerating now. But I swear it was practically instantaneous. 1 minute it was sunshine, and the next I could barely see in front of me, even with the headlights on. It was like the night just slammed down on my car. I must have gotten confused at some point, because I somehow found myself driving down a narrow side road away from the main highway that I was supposed to take. It cut right through the surrounding woods, and the trees were practically touching the sides of my car. I thought about trying to turn around, but I quickly realized it wasn't possible. I checked my GPS app and saw that if I just kept going for a couple more miles, there would be a spot where I could merge back onto the main road. As I drove, I started getting this really creepy feeling like I was being watched. I told myself that I was just tired and spooked from the long drive. I mean, I was in the middle of nowhere at night. Nobody was out here but me, right? I managed to calm myself down, but barely a minute passed before I heard the most terrifying sound ever. It was a high-pitched shriek, and I thought it was an animal, but somehow it sounded eerily human. It startled me so bad that I automatically pressed the gas a little harder. Everything happened so fast. First I felt the car dip, then there was a loud bang. Then I jerked the steering wheel hard to the right to get away from the noise, but the car just sort of dragged. I took my foot off the gas. My heart was beating so fast I thought I'd die. It took me a second to calm down enough to realize that I'd probably just blown a tire. According to GPS, I was really close to the highway. I called Janet to let her know what had happened. She said she'd pick me up, but she sounded very worried. She said to walk the rest of the road to the highway and don't hang up. I was nervous about traveling alone and on foot, but it was a short walk, and I was still on the phone with Janet, so I felt a little better. I had almost reached the edge of the trees when this awful stench hit my nose. It was definitely something rotten and decaying. I don't know what death smells like, but I'm sure this must be it. Then it happened. A blood-curdling shriek, just like before, but closer this time. Much, much closer. And it sounded like it was directly behind me. I turned around and I swear that for a second I saw a pair of glowing red dots like eyes, but they disappeared behind the trees. I freaked out and started sprinting for the highway. I don't know why, but somehow I was certain that something was pursuing me, and that it was just letting me go because it wanted to. There were no more screams, but that horrible smell stayed. After that, it was a blur. I just remember vague flashes, reaching the highway, getting in Janet's car, walking in her front door. I don't think either of us said more than a couple words. The next morning, everything was weirdly normal. Janet was oddly chipper and gushed about being so glad to see me. My car was even parked in her driveway with all 4 tires intact. I tried to talk to her about what happened last night, but she just kept saying vague stuff about how it must have been a tiring drive and how she always had weird dreams after a long trip. Maybe it was just a weird dream. Janet and I had a great time catching up and swimming in the nearby lake. Everything was perfect until it was time for me to go home. I hadn't gone into my car since I got to Janet's place, and when I opened my car door, I got hit full in the face by a horrible stench, rot and decay. It was the same horrible smell as that night in the woods. If the smell is real, then what else about that night is real? I don't even know if I want to find out. I'm Italian and live in Italy. I want to tell you about this wild experience I had in Ravello, Italy. Ravello is this cool village on the cliffs of Italy's Amalfi Coast. My name's Carlo, and I'm just a history professor from Rome, and I'm really into stories about my country. Every summer, I take a break to go somewhere and dig into some history. This time, Ravello was my choice because of its old buildings and great views. So I was walking around the place one evening. That night, as it usually happens, when the sun went down, the streets get lit by lanterns. The shadows got all long, and although beautiful, were also a bit creepy. And I could smell flowers blooming and hear the sea not too far away. Then, out of nowhere, everything suddenly went silent. It was like the whole town stopped breathing or something. Right then, I heard this weird noise, kind of like wings flapping in the wind. The silence got even more intense, except for that flapping sound. So, naturally, I got curious and decided to check it out. I followed the sound and ended up at this old, run-down cathedral that was just at the top of the hill, maybe a 5-minute walk. At first, I looked around but saw nothing. I knew this church welcomed visitors at any time, and so I went inside, hating how the wooden doors made this creaking sound that echoed all over. Once inside, I walked around slowly as my eyes got used to the dim light of just the candles, and I saw something I can't even begin to explain. It was off in a corner, and its movement caught my attention. At first, I thought it was a priest or other church worker, but at first I couldn't quite tell. What confused me was that it was tall, about 6 feet, but looked like a mix between a man and an animal. It had black feathers all over it, and these huge leather wings, like a bat's, were on its back. I wondered at first if it was some type of ancient cloak and that I was intruding on some unique ceremony. Let's just say that I wasn't a regular churchgoes, and so anything could have been the truth at that point. But anyway, the craziest part was its face, or rather, the lack of one. When this thing finally turned and looked toward me, I could tell that there were just 2 big red eyes glowing in the dark. Man, I was scared. My heart was beating like crazy, and I was sweating bullets. My legs felt like jelly, and I was just trying to make sense of what I was seeing. So there I was, still inside the cathedral, my heart pounding so loudly it sounded like drums. I was sweaty, my legs were wobbly, and I couldn't stop my hands from shaking. And all the while, that thing just kept staring at me with its glowing red eyes, not moving or making a sound. You know that feeling when you lock eyes with someone and there's like a connection? It was like that, but way more intense. I felt like it knew me somehow, and it gave me the creeps. Time just seemed to stop as we stared at each other. Finally, I got up the nerve to take a step back, even though every part of me was yelling to run away. But the creature didn't move. It just kept looking at me, and then it opened its wings. Man, they were even bigger and scarier than I first thought. The rustling sound they made filled the whole place, and I couldn't help but feel a mix of amazement and terror. Then, out of nowhere, it made this sound. I can't even describe it. It wasn't a growl or a roar, but something older, more unsettling. It bounced off the walls and hit me right in the chest. And then with one big flap, it flew up into the cathedral's roof, like up into the rafters, and was then gone. I couldn't see it at all anymore. It was like it knew of a secret exit up there. That was it for me. I turned and ran out of there as fast as I could, but somehow I could feel it watching me, and I even thought I heard the soft sound of its wings as it took off. I didn't stop running until I was back in the busy main section of Ravello, where I collapsed against a wall, trying to catch my breath. I was back in reality, but I couldn't shake what had just happened. The memory of that creature, its wings, and those glowing eyes was stuck in my head. I spent the rest of the night just trying to process it all. Even now, as I'm writing this down, I still feel terrified. It's just so unbelievable, so eerie. In the ensuing days, I found myself drawn back to the cathedral, back to the place of the encounter. I was driven by a strange fascination, a need to understand what I had witnessed. The creature was never there, despite stopping multiple times at different times of the day. Its existence marked only by the faint trace of an otherworldly presence. But maybe it was only me who felt that. The encounter changed me, in ways I can still hardly comprehend. My pursuit of history, of forgotten tales and mysteries, had led me too close to something I had wanted to see. Basically, I crossed paths with a creature of legends. From then on, every creak of a door, every rustle of feathers, every hint of a shadow brought me back to that night. The creature had vanished, but its memory loomed large for me. It was spring of 2014, and I was staying with friends in Salt Lake City for a few days. The weather was fantastic, the roads were clear, and it seemed like the perfect time to stretch my legs and head out on a solo overnight trip to see some great hiking trails. I had never hiked in Utah before, but I was excited to see some of its beautiful forests and trails and to just check out for a few days. I found that there are many websites that gave directions for good places to explore, and also some visual imagery books online that provided detailed accounts on certain trails for people who want to explore on their own. This saved me a lot of money and time by planning out the trails for myself. So I drove the 4-hour or so trip south to Dixie National Forest, found a beautiful spot to camp, and settled in. The beautiful rock formations made me think I might stay longer than I had intended. It was absolutely gorgeous. An hour or so later, I ventured out and found a nice trailhead with a little bit of everything: mountains with waterfalls, cliffs, small caves, and forest. I had my backpack ready with plenty of water and snacks, along with a camera and first aid kit. I had never hiked with so many beautiful things to look at. In fact, I was starting to feel overwhelmed on which trail I should take and wanted to be sure to see all the best stuff. There were not very many people out hiking yet, and after a few hours my mind started playing tricks on me. It seemed like there was always someone in the shadows of every corner. Was this my imagination, or was something else going on? Maybe I just really needed to relax and clear my head. Maybe this weirdness was just detoxing the real world out of my system. Anyway, I stayed alert and just walked forward. I didn't venture off the trails since I did not want to be careless in case there may have been bears or other wild animals lurking around. I was also thinking there might be snakes hiding off the trails, and I'm crazy, stupid scared of those. After about another hour of walking, the sun suddenly went down and it became very dark. I wasn't used to it getting so dark so fast, since that doesn't seem to happen where I live. And now I found myself where there were no lights anywhere, and I could barely see further than 30 or 40 feet ahead of me. Luckily, I had a headlamp in my pack, and I put it on to see where I was going. I didn't want to admit quite yet that I might not be heading in the direction I needed to be. It wasn't long until I started noticing that the trees around me looked very odd. Their bark looked unusual, and I started to think that they looked like figures swaying in the dark. Their branches also made strange sounds, as if something was moving underneath them. My curiosity, it was really fear, became too overwhelming, so I stopped to take photos of it all with my camera, telling myself it was a really cool photo opportunity. I set the delay on the camera and started taking pictures. I told myself, for documentation purposes. That's when I noticed just how quiet it really was around me. No birds, no crickets, not even the sound of trees blowing in the wind, even though I was clearly watching them move. At this point, I knew there was a good chance I may have been lost, so I wanted to keep looking for the trail markers, hoping to find something I knew. I didn't want to turn back because that was obviously not the right direction. I had packed my hiking sticks with me, so I pulled them out, figuring it would be easy if I just needed to jab something that looked dangerous or out of the ordinary. And right when I got them out and started walking with them, that's when I saw it. The thing was about 10 yards away, and he was staring directly at me, his eyes gleaming back in the reflection of my headlamp. He looked like a dog, with a dog head and dog eyes, but his body was massive compared to his head size. He was probably 7 feet tall and just loomed over everything around. I froze. My head was trying to figure out why this dog would be so big. And then all of a sudden, all of my senses kicked in, and I realized that I was in deep danger. I trembled uncontrollably and couldn't run. That thing was standing on 2 legs and started to walk towards me, slowly, which seems like a good thing, but the confidence in its slow, purposeful walk was the scariest thing I've ever seen. It was so surreal because it walked like a human while having mostly only dog features from the neck up. But then its arms were so long and his hands were like dog paws, and they were massive. I had to run. My brain knew that I had to run, but my legs weren't responding. I turned the headlamp towards the trail and headed as fast as I could down the trail, trying to find markers of any kind, basically hoping I was headed in the right direction. But the creature followed, and he was breathing heavily behind me, close enough for me to hear it. I was all too aware of his hot breath raging out of his mouth, and my head was pounding, and the blood rushing through it sounded like thunder in my ears. The creature's dog paws hitting the ground was loud too, loud enough that I could tell he was close to me. At one point, I turned around to look and was dumbfounded to see that he was running only on his back legs, just like a human would run. And now I was able to see what he looked like in full view. His eyes were glowing and his mouth was dripping with saliva. His fur was moving as it ran, and then there was the smell. It was all terrifying. And then in what seemed like a split second, before I could do anything, he was right next to me, almost as if like magic, and he swatted at me, but I dodged away just in time before turning and continuing to run for my life. The thing's dog claws cut through my long-sleeve shirt and barely missed my skin. The thought of getting seriously injured or even killed ran through my mind. It was all too real at this point. I knew I had to get out of there fast before this thing got another chance at me, since he was obviously very fast, very smart, and very sneaky. I kept running as fast as my legs could move until the creature finally gave up chasing me. It just totally disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. I knew it had given up, or basically decided to stop on its own, because it had already proved to be much faster than I could have ever run. And next, all I was aware of was that I could hear a dog barking in the distance. Was it the creature or someone's pet? Hopefully someone's pet. But the barking seemed to be getting further and further away with each passing second, so I couldn't figure it out. The truth is that the barking actually made me feel a little bit safer, thinking that maybe it was just a regular pet dog after all, but I still didn't know for sure, so I kept running, hoping to find someone who could help me. And then, just like that, I came across a trail marker that I had never seen before. I studied it for a second and then realized that it was taking me in the right direction. So from there on out, I pretty much just followed the markers and eventually made my way back to camp. I can't tell you how this encounter has completely changed my life. It's been over 7 years since this point, and I still won't solo camp or head out on the hiking trails alone. The fear of being alone is so strong for me now. I just hope that someday I can put this trauma behind me and get back to being myself. Even now, that creature runs through my head every time I go out on the trails with friends, and I truly feel like something bad is going to happen. That the thing is always there. Honestly, that encounter still haunts me to this day like some sort of unreal dream, but very real. I'm scared. I just don't know if I will ever be myself again. Some things can't be rationalized or explained. I understand that. I know when some things are more make-believe than factual, but I have to admit I found myself in one heck of a dilemma that summer night. I'm not one for ghost stories. My grandparents sure liked telling them when I was growing up, but they weren't for me. I liked reality, even as a kid. So that's what makes this encounter so difficult for me to express, because I cannot explain with certainty what all had happened. Being part of law enforcement, we are taught to think with logic and factually accurate information. And even though our town was a bit into folklore and all of that, we knew what was real and what wasn't. That's how it was to me then. Black and white, fact and fiction. I've mentioned I've heard stories about spooky things. So I was familiar with some of the crazy things people dreamed up, but I never gave them much weight. Anyhow, I was working one day. It was hot. It was the middle of summer. This particular day we had been called to help a lady. She said that some delinquents were harassing her and her kids. She said they'd been doing some awful things like throwing rocks at her kids in their house. One had even taken out one of her windows. The woman was furious, as one might imagine. She said that her kids had been playing in the backyard and that they had seen someone in the trees. She said that they were throwing rocks at her kids. So her kids do what kids do. Monkey see, monkey do. You know the saying. And her kids start throwing rocks. They think it's some fun game that they got going on. But one of the kids got a rock to the head. The woman thought her kid had a concussion. But they didn't. They were fine. But the problem was that they continued to do it, and someone else was teaching them to do it. This was many decades ago, so teaching your kids right from wrong was very straight and narrow. If I had that woman for a mother, I would have been scared to get the belt. You know what I mean? But the woman said she was wanting to get to the bottom of the behavior and hold the juveniles accountable for teaching her kids such awful behavior. I agreed with the woman. Something needed to be done. So, we went to the woman's home. Sure enough, one of her windows was busted out, and one of the kids was still walking around with a bandage wrapped all the way around their head. It was a bit unusual. The situation, sometimes I still think about it. Something just seemed off right off the bat, but what we discovered was much darker than some teenagers being knuckleheads. We interviewed the children and the mother. The mother just kept talking about how those kids needed to be punished, and where were their parents? Sometimes when someone is so worked up like that, the best thing to do is nod your head. Because nobody is going to change their mind. That's how my mother was too, and my sister. All of us in our family, really. When we have our minds made up, good luck. So then we start talking to the children. The oldest one stated that they were outside playing tag, and that someone had been throwing rocks, so they started throwing rocks back. They said it was to teach the other person a lesson at first, but that it eventually turned into a fun game. The middle child, the one with the bandage, had said that they'd been playing this game for a couple of weeks now. They hadn't seen the kid who was playing with them, but that they were starting to make good friends. The youngest, they had the most information. They said that the kid in the woods was more like a man, and that they could see their eyes in the trees, that they smelt awfully bad. But they then said, "Mama says we can't make fun of people for that." So we made friends. At this point, I'm starting to fear that the children are interacting with a town squatter. But I don't tell Mother anything. I didn't want to frighten her. I stayed several days at the house. But it wasn't until the fourth day that the rocks started to hit the house again. The woman was angry, and she started pacing around her house, shouting all sorts of things. But I told her that she needed to keep it down so I could catch the perpetrator in the act. She did as much, but she didn't like it. I quietly made my way outside and my way out towards the back. Sure enough, rocks were flying past my head, so I had to keep ducking. Eventually, I found myself behind a big pile of firewood, and I just stayed behind that. Those rocks weren't stopping, so I had to start yelling at the person, but it didn't make much difference. Finally, I peeked my head around the side of the firewood, and I could see whoever it was hiding being the trees. It was a dark figure, and it smelled terrible, just like the child had said, and it looked as if it were watching me. The rocks finally stopped. I'm not sure if it was because they didn't have any more to throw, or if it was because it saw me looking at them. So I edged closer to the perpetrator. But it ran away. Fast. Before it did, I got a bit more of a look at it. And truth be told, that thing was covered in dark hair. Now, I told you I don't do ghost stories or anything like that, but I can't quite explain what was throwing those rocks. You hear these stories growing up and you think, that's not true. No way. But I'm realizing the world isn't as black and white as I thought. Maybe there are some gray areas in between. Hey there, I really think that my story is something wild, and you'll probably be able to make more sense of it than me. I live in a pretty rural town down in Kansas, and a few months ago I saw the strangest thing I've ever laid my eyes on. There was this one morning that I had to go to the DMV and get a new license. Mine had expired. I got up early, way earlier than normal, and overall it seemed like a typical morning. It was then on my drive to the DMV when I saw it. Halfway there, I'm driving through my rural town into the more metro area of where I live, and I notice that there is some huge thing in the sky nearly right above my car. At first, I freaked out. There was some flying object in the sky, and whatever it was descending to the ground and fast. I thought at first that it was a plane, and that stressed me out more than anything. Was it a terrorist attack? Was there some kind of internal malfunction? I wanted to call the police or something, but the fact is I sort of figured someone else already had. Besides, I was in shock and wasn't reacting properly. Anyway, whatever it was crashing. There was a stream of smoke coming out from behind it, clear as day. The odd thing was, as it came closer to the ground, closer into my field of vision, I realized it was definitely not a plane, or a helicopter, or anything I've seen in my life. So now I'm watching it way, way closer, because I want to see where the thing is going to drop. I know that curiosity killed the cat, but this seemed like something important, or at least abnormal enough to pay attention to. It was shaped like a CGI starship from a Marvel movie or something. It wasn't a flying saucer, but the way it was designed looked very foreign. It was gray, and for all intents and purposes, too large to go unnoticed, and too large to be in the sky for that matter. Eventually, after a short while, I see it descend closer and closer to the ground, nearby but definitely a few miles out. I figured, hey, I'm already late for my appointment. I should go see what the hell this is about. So now I'm speeding my way towards where I saw the thing crash. I was going quick as hell, and I got there in less than 10 minutes. I parked on the side of the road because it crashed in a kind of woodsy area I could only get to on foot. I can't lie, the adrenaline was high, and I was very excited to find this thing and figure out what the hell it was. Much to my dismay, though, when I got to the crash site, there was nothing there. I mean, there was a hole in the ground, but nothing else. It was just a massive, empty crater in the middle of the woods. I thought I was going crazy. I thought at first that I had imagined the entire thing. And then I tried to rationalize that I had found the wrong spot, that this wasn't really where it had landed. But I soon understood that neither of those things were the case. Nope. In actuality, the damn thing just disappeared. But I'll tell you this, it didn't disappear without a trace. I jumped down into the big hole at the crash site to have a look around, and to check that the ship wasn't like invisible or something, and believe it or not, I found some debris. Debris is vague, I know, but this was the really strange part. I collected all the weird rocks that were scattered at the base of the crater and shoved them in my pockets. I looked around but found nothing else strange, and so I skedaddled out of there ASAP and took off in my car. Right away I called my friend Tom, who's a rockhound and amateur geologist. He analyzed them and tested their densities and checked for Mohs hardness, or whatever, and tells me that the rocks I found were scraps of meteorites. That's right, rocks from the sky. Insane. You might not see how this is substantial, but the fact is that if what I saw was any other known aeronautical machine, there's no way in hell it would have been up in space like it was. There's no way it would have vanished, disappeared with almost no trace. Unless, of course, it was something much rarer than any old airplane. My personal theory is that the thing teleported, that it entered our atmosphere and crashed somehow. And then by using some kind of weird technology, it got teleported back to wherever it came from before anyone else could see it. I've been scratching my head, kind of going crazy about it, to be honest. Since then, I haven't seen anything strange, but that doesn't mean I haven't been on the lookout for it. I bought a huge telescope, and now I find myself frequenting some unsavory parts of the internet to try and make sense of everything I witnessed. Not a lot of people in my personal life believe me, so I'm hoping at least you will.